Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the third session of EPHA's Access to Medicines Dialogues. Access to Medicines Dialogues is a brand new series of online events on various access to medicines topics. We launched Access to Medicines Dialogues already in October. We had 2 webinars, and I'm delighted to welcome our speakers tonight for the third one. My name is Yannis Natsis. I'm the policy lead at EPHA for our Access to Medicines Advocacy. And today we will look at COVID-19 and pharma. We will look at how the pandemic is reshaping the dynamics between governments and the pharmaceutical companies. We will look at how the pandemic is going to influence and is already influencing the access to medicines debate in Europe, but also the power balance between pharmaceutical companies and governments in Europe and beyond. I think it is high time to look back, look at what has happened over the past few months. Too much has happened in a very short period of time. To look at how the relations were between pharmaceutical companies and governments before the pandemic and where they stand today, but also try, with the help of our excellent guest speakers today, to foresee the major trends, the outlook for the coming months and years to come. It is a great pleasure to be joined today by Jack Scannell. Jack Scannell, I met him, welcome Jack. I met him in Gastein at the European Health Forum Gastein in 2015 at the very interesting debate. Back then the debates in this kind of fora were kind of different compared to today. So Jack Scannell is an expert in science and economics of drug development, and we will hear from him. He's a tamed capitalist, in my opinion, as opposed to Andrew Elder. I will describe him as the wild capitalist amongst us. Andrew is one of the voices that we don't usually hear about, especially at events hosted by civil society. He works for Albion Capital, so he brings the voice of the investors. And I think this is a voice that we should listen to carefully to understand better how this sector thinks and operates. And that brings me, of course, to Els Torelle. Els Torelle is one of my mentors on a personal level. Els has played a lot of key roles in the access to medicines movement. She has been with DNDi, she has been with the MSF Access Campaign, with Open Society Foundations, and recently she joined Mariana Mazzucato at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose as a visiting policy fellow. And of course, last but not least, Michelle Childs. Michelle, another legend in the access to medicines movement worldwide with years of experience, and currently the director of policy and advocacy with a very successful alternative drug development model, the one that we all know, DNDi, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your time. I invite our viewers online to engage on Twitter. You can tweet using our hashtag access to medicines, A2M dialogues, or hashtag A2M solutions. The session is recorded and you will be able to see it later on the EPHA YouTube channel. I invite you to check our channel out. You will also be able to find the recordings of the previous 2 webinars. So I'll start with Els. Els, as I said, she's been following the relationship and how the dynamic between governments in Europe and worldwide with pharma has evolved throughout the years. We've had interesting discussions in Europe in light of the pricing issue in Brussels and beyond over the past 5-6 years. Els, how do you think the current pandemic is changing, if it is changing, the dynamic between governments in Europe and pharmaceutical companies?
Thank you, Yannis, for inviting me and for this question. It's a challenging question because, of course, I think that we all agree that everything has changed in a way in the last 8 months since COVID has arrived. But if there are 2 particular trends or things that have stood out for me in relation to what we are discussing, is at one hand that from the very early days of the pandemic and the recognition that it was a pandemic and that we are all somehow in the same boat, and relying on, or the hope is at least that certain health technologies, drugs, diagnostics, and in particular vaccines will really be a solution to get us out of the pandemic. There has been an expression by many people, including political leaders everywhere, that everybody should have access to these new health technologies, that and this is new. I mean, all of us that have been in the access movement, there was always something like, well, yeah, we need to ensure that this or that subpopulation or this and that country also have access. But this expression of everybody should have immediate and affordable access to these new health technologies, I think is significant. And I hope we can build upon that, so that we kind of for the future know that health technologies are not ordinary commodities, but should be, and there were all kinds of words being used, global public goods, global health commons, I mean, whatever they mean in practice. But I think the essence is that, they should be available and affordable and accessible to everybody, which I think we need to hold on to. We all know that in practice, things are turning out slightly different. What we have seen on the diagnostics, the PPEs, etc., and now vaccines will become available probably shortly, and we will see that that's probably not yet, the practice will not be there, but at least the intention is there, and this is a general consensus. The second is been that governments, and what you were mentioning in Europe the last couple of years, there was a lot of analysis and criticism and a certain challenging of the current pharmaceutical industry model that delivers not necessarily the medicines that we need, for instance, antibiotics, and what it delivers is excessively expensive. I mean, the balance, there was a sense that the balance was completely the balance of power in the advantage of the industry, and that governments were actually with their back against the wall, but they started to react to that and trying to rebalance and take a little bit more power and leverage their power. Now, what we see in COVID is that all of that has suddenly disappeared. The governments look at the pharmaceutical companies for a solution and don't seem to put any conditions. If they put a lot of money, apparently, as far as we know, because we haven't seen the contracts, with very little or no strings attached. And somehow there is no willingness of governments to use their leverage to ensure that what the companies do and develop effectively are the health tools and technologies we need, and that they will be affordable and accessible. And somehow the fact that we have now this instead of multilateralism, something that seems to be called multi-stakeholderalism, where the role of the private sector has become much bigger, and the public oversight or the leverage from the public sector to protect public health has been watered down. Those are for me the two big main elements.
Thank you, Els. And Michelle, I think, you've been with the NDI. You do team up with pharmaceutical companies in the pursuit of drug development, and I think we can all agree that pharma is an indispensable partner. But what would you like to see if indeed there are no questions asked on behalf of governments? If you share that and that reading of the situation, of the current situation, what would you like to see in terms of the governments using their leverage? And as Els said, apparently it seems that currently and during the pandemic, since the onset of this public health emergency, the governments are throwing a lot of money at the industry.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me. I mean, I think I'd stand back first of all and say, we have to look at where we started in this pandemic. I mean, it was predicted by many people, and we already knew that the existing business model wouldn't work for pandemics, and it doesn't work for many other health areas, primarily because pandemics are not predictable, and therefore it doesn't really work on the current funding model. And although we have seen quite a lot of progress by some companies, and obviously we have to make sure that we study the science. We've had very hopeful outcomes, but we need to make sure that we review those outcomes, not based on press releases, which can inflate CEOs' pay, but actually from a public health point of view. That said, I think what we can see, and this is reflected in many other public health issues, is that you actually need to have both a private and a public involvement. You know, some of the reason that we started from a slow start is not just because of the industry, but because the governments themselves had failed to invest. And although it's difficult to draw too many lessons because we're still in the where we are with COVID, I think it's already clear that no one country or company or organization can actually deal with this themselves. And what we need is sort of global collaboration and cooperation. And that's very familiar, I think, to DNDi, where, you know, we're a virtual organization. We depend on partnerships with both the public and the private sector, small and big pharma, academic and other institutes. What's clear to us, and I think is building a bit on what Els has said, is that if you want to be successful in those types of collaborative agreements, there are some critical things you need. First of all, you need to have a shared vision, and that really needs to be set by the governments. And they started off here saying, you know, we want access, but we've had one step forward, one step back, I think, when they're faced with the reality. The second is that you need to underpin that vision with clear agreements, and those agreements have to look at and anticipate some of the barriers that you might face. Some of those are in relation to the ownership of information, of data, of clinical trial data. Some of those are how you would price or make available particular goods, and some of those are around how post-registration you would ensure supply, and all of those issues are coming into play here. And I think part of the problem is that because we didn't have a kind of global access agreement or these agreements in place beforehand, we're now faced with the fear factor. And what we have found is that you really need to address access right at the beginning, because if you attempt to have these discussions at the time when you're fighting over access to a particular product, it's extremely difficult to do. And I think what we have seen is that we have seen some evidence of companies that are prepared to make some moves in relation to sharing their information, but that hasn't been consistent, it hasn't been systematic. We've seen governments, particularly in Europe, showing leadership in relation to equitable access, but then they've fallen back, not just on businesses falling back on business as usual and enclosing that information, but governments falling back on policies as usual, which is about, particularly in Europe, buying your way to the front of the queue and leaving other, particularly low and middle income countries at the back of the queue. And so I think, you know, what's clear, and what I would hope that European governments did going forward, and also course correct now in Corona, is to recognize that we need to take some key steps. Firstly, we need to remove some of the barriers that are stopping scale up and access, and they have an opportunity this week. There is a call led by India and African countries to have a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights so that they can scale up. We have the ability for governments to impose some conditions on further funding. We also have an opportunity for them to really push further in relation to looking at how they allocate the resources that they have already purchased. So for me, I think it's course correcting where we already are in relation to COVID, but also acknowledging that we're dealing with things that we haven't resolved. And those things include how you finance research and development, because the current way of relying on monopolies and high returns doesn't work for public health. And we have to look at dealing with things that are quite difficult to do about how you do fair allocation.
Thank you, Michelle. Andrew, I want to come to you because, as I said, we don't hear often from people like you. And firstly, I would like you to briefly explain to our viewers, what is it exactly that you do, so that we understand a bit where you come from practically. And secondly, I want you to be honest with us and tell us, how do the things that Els and Michelle just talked about, do they resonate with you? And when I say with you, I don't mean with you on a personal level, but I mean with your world, with your ecosystem. To me, it seems like a parallel universe, correct me if I'm wrong, or perhaps detached, or perhaps you have different priorities that you're looking at. So could you please explain to us?
Sure, thank you, Yanis. So I'm what's called, I suppose, a venture capitalist. So we invest capital into early stage ventures, and that can be anything from an idea in a lab and a patent, maybe a cell therapy, a drug, an antibody or something, or even a piece of software. We invest in technology in general, whether it's therapeutics or other tools. But it's early stage, and we invest capital and we invest expertise in helping build that company from often just a few people to hundreds of people. We grow the revenue, and we grow the service or product that company is providing. And we invest, as I said, everything from software to therapeutics. And so we have a particular interest in innovation. And so we're basically backing innovation which can have high growth. And I think our interest in the way sort of COVID's come along and changed things is that it's changing the way different stakeholders or sectors within healthcare and life sciences in general, by that I mean the pharma sector, I mean the regulators, I mean the hospitals, I mean scientists and universities, and I mean patients. So all the various stakeholders around the issue of treating patients and disease. And we think that there's been some really quite big and fundamental changes in the way those stakeholders interact. And that's important for a number of reasons. And well, fundamentally, from our perspective, it's we're seeing things which are changing, which will accelerate the adoption of innovation. And that's good from our perspective, because we fundamentally want to grow things faster, that we can sell in our company for more than we invested in. So there is a pure financial goal here, but I think there's also an altruistic one, in the sense that everyone in the healthcare sector, investing in the private sector, is doing it for reasons of improving health outcomes. Financially, you can gain from that, and there is a place for private capital in that whole delivery of innovation and healthcare. And so the acceleration of innovation, both creation of innovation, the way it's translated into products, the way it's then regulated and approved and coming onto the market, we've seen this magnificent sort of global collaboration and sort of ecosystem just operate on a completely different level in the last 9 months. Every stakeholder has interacted with every other stakeholder in a different way. And I think this is illustrated by several big changes that I've seen. And the first is actually that I think from a private capital perspective, we understand how our flows work, but I think that public capital has found its place in the sort of public eye, and also from the private capital markets eye, in a way that I just don't think it was quite understood. And by that, I mean that public capital can do a whole range of things very quickly and very fast and very at great scale, in a way that private capital just often can't. Private capital has to operate where markets are efficient, typically. And in things like public health, it's not about markets. There's no efficient markets. And we see that with antimicrobials. There isn't an efficient market for private capital to come in. And what we also see is in vaccines, it's exactly the same. Vaccines has suffered from lack of private capital in the past because of that lack of commercial case. You don't have consistent uptake and sales. You have to treat pandemics, and you never know when those are going to come along. So it's a bad place for private capital to find a place. Public capital has really found its place here, because it can deploy enormous amounts of capital quickly in the innovation side. But there's also just that manufacturing and distribution side. What we found is that private capital markets over the last however many decades have been continually refining its model around efficiency, and efficiency drives lack of capacity, essentially. It drives a lack of resilience in supply chains. You lose excess capacity, so that it's this sort of globalized, just-in-time type world where everything is, we're all interactive. We all need to get our piece of the supply chain just when we need it, from anywhere in the world. What we've recently seen with COVID is we're having to move away from that, where we have national capacity for diagnostics or for manufacturing of vaccines or for innovation. We have to be able to do it nationally, and that's not necessarily a good thing. We don't want to become nationalistic about it, but what it has shown is that there is a place for government money, public money, to create capacity, whether it's in hospitals, in diagnostics industries, in vaccine manufacturing, where the private markets can't operate. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is just the way that these government money can interact with pharma and universities, for example. So the way the AstraZeneca-Oxford collaboration came together very quickly. So John Bell was at the center of it. He had interaction with government, with AstraZeneca, with Oxford. He knew them all, pulled it together in a week, as I understand. And that deal was signed, a very large deal, moving very, very quickly. And that just shows what can happen when everyone finds their place. Public money has its place, it's got cash, it's got scale, but it's got a political need. Pharma had cash and scale and manufacturing and distribution, and the Oxford University had the innovation. Those pieces all need each other when you want to move fast and you want to move into a world where private capital on its own, it's just not efficient enough. Public health, as Michelle said, is a different world. It's not conducive to efficient capital markets, and so everyone needs each other.
Thank you, Andrew. That's very interesting. Jack, I mean, what has struck you over the past months, since the onset of the crisis, in the dynamic between governments and pharma, also based on what Andrew just talked about, the public stepping in, throwing money at different sectors, trying to use its leverage, if you agree. But really, what has struck you compared to, let's say, January 2020 or December 2019?
My first answer isn't precisely to your question, but it's the thing that struck me most probably since the start of COVID to where we are now. And that is how lucky we appear to have got on the vaccines. Right, so I did an awful lot of work with vaccine experts early in the COVID crisis where people were saying, you know, I would allocate any one of these platforms a 50% chance of working. And if they work, the vaccines are going to reduce risk of infection by 50%. So this is going to be a long, slow, painful slog. And look, who knows, maybe the results have been inflated, but I think at the moment, it looks like we have got very, very lucky. And then coming back to kind of cost and efficiency, you know, I don't know a huge amount about the transparency or intransparency of the deals between governments and the drug companies. And it may be because we've got lucky with the vaccines. It seems that a remarkably small amount of money has been spent on them or will be spent on them compared to the benefit we'll get. So for example, if you look at estimates of the GDP impact alone of COVID-19, it's running on 10 trillion a year. You know, I think the amount that the companies will get for the vaccines is certainly no more than 100 billion, maybe less. If anyone's got a better number here, they can let me know. And, you know, so, you know, so we are talking very small single digit or less than single digit percentages of the GDP gain that will be made for getting any life, you know, health gains from vaccines, right? And I think at the moment complaining that that's a bit intransparent, it's a bit like, well, I may be being unfair here, I'm going to tease people here deliberately, but it's a bit like saying in 1943, as people are landing on the beaches at D-Day saying, you know, this penicillin I've got, I wish the contract with Pfizer to manufacture it had been a bit more transparent, right? This, I think actually we've got really lucky. And in 5 years' time, people won't be, I think, another thing I would say is there could be 5, 6, 7 or 8 good vaccines, right? And there'll be a great opportunity then for governments to run competitive tenders, right, and grind out the price. I've also talked to a few friends of mine who are still in investment, and they certainly, the likes of Sanofi, Glaxo, AstraZeneca, people don't think they're going to make they're not going to make meaningful profits on these drugs. I guess Moderna and Pfizer may. So I think the vaccines thing has gone. I think we've got lucky, and it's gone well. What else? I maybe
will make money in different ways, though, no? In the mid and long run. I mean, besides the market of COVID vaccines.
Okay, so that's true. They will. So, for example, Moderna will do well because what's happened is a whole new vaccine production technology has been proved that they might be able to use for other applications. But we do very well out of that as well because we get to benefit from the vaccines that they may produce. I think one other thing I'll say, maybe controversial here, I think actually something's happened quietly that, in my view, may have a bigger impact on actually it hasn't happened quietly, but may have a bigger impact on the relationship between European countries and the pharmaceutical industry, strangely enough, than COVID. And that is a Biden presidency, but possibly a Republican Senate. And I think for European countries, actually, the dynamic of drug pricing and drug price reform in the US is actually a large constraint on pricing and access. And because you've got Biden in the White House and probably a Republican Senate, probably nothing's going to change in the US. And that means that European governments are going to be grinding their teeth because the European prices will be constrained by the US for the next 5 years or 4 years.
Thank you for teasing us and for provoking some discussion. I'm gonna turn to Els. I'm sure that she would like to respond to some of this. So Els, at the end of the day, as Jack says, even if it costs us, even if these contracts are not transparent, even if they cost like 4 or 5 billion that we are investing as the public in Europe to de-risk or share the risk. What is it compared to, at the end of the day, it's nothing compared to keeping Europe open, the economy up and going. What do you think?
Well, it won't be a surprise to if I say that I think that's not quite how I look at the world, in the sense that measuring value in health in terms of percentage GDP that can be saved or etc. I mean, it's just a totally different world. And I think one of the things we've realized is that in fact that health is so essential and should be central to driving economic, and I'm not going to say growth, but actually our society's activities and how we organize the economy. And what we have today is the other way around. Everything is around measured success in economic terms is measured in terms of growth in GDP, in dollar values, in returns, etc. While what we need is actually not then measure improving health, how much does that cost, but revaluing the concept of a healthy society in a sustainable environment, for that matter, because as the central premise of why we have an economy. And then you don't measure it in terms of or compare it in terms of how much percentage economic GDP has been lost or gained. I think we need to totally rethink and say, like, we need to build an economy that functions with the health and well-being at the center as the purpose of the economy, not something that is kind of collateral and may or may not be pulled in. And so I think that measuring it from an economic term, and also we're now doing all these things for COVID, and how much lives are being lost by the diseases. I mean, kids that are not being vaccinated with measles, people that have TB, HIV/AIDS, that have no access to their medicines. There's plenty of collateral damage on health that no one talks about. And all these millions that are being invested in COVID, they won't go to these other things. And so I think it's we need to have a holistic approach and not value health in terms of a dollar value.
Andrew, you are the investor amongst us. I know you want to say something, and then over to Michelle. But you as the investor, you explained to us, you highlighted the importance of the public capital. Are you happy with how this public capital is invested? What would you do? We hear a lot, for instance, in Brussels these days of the EU setting up a biomedical agency, advanced agency like the US BARDA. If you were in the driver's seat from the public perspective, how would you like that to work, for instance?
It's a good question. Can I come back to that? And
yes,
I just like
please.
quickly, actually, just agree with Els. You might be slightly surprised that the private capitalists would agree with that sort of position, but actually, it touched on what I said at the beginning. I think this eternal focus on GDP has been one of the things which has created our lack of resilience and capacity in supply chain issues, and this relentless focus on efficiency. And I think that's been found wanting. We've suddenly woken up and saying, actually, that just doesn't work for everything, like public health is a classic example. And so finding different ways of valuing things is absolutely critical. And I think certainly of my end of the private investment world would also realize that, because we're not trying to financially structure and engineer things to be more and more efficient. We are investing in innovation. And that innovation is fundamentally about changing the world for the better and creating better outcomes and so on. It's not about making things per se more efficient for the sake of it. Whereas the bigger end of some of my market, and maybe where people get, the sort of the bigger investors may give some of the industry a bad name, is that it is much more around that sort of relentless focus on the dollar. So I think there is an argument. I completely agree. We should come away from just valuing everything on a dollar basis and look at the macro picture. And that's where everyone can then find a place, the public money, the private money, the innovation, everyone finds a place. And I think we've done a good job in helping with that. And then to your point about public money and is it spent well and should we focus on it? I mean, clearly it's all our taxes. We want it to be spent well, and it should be spent well. But there's a trade-off between spending something well and spending it, quickly in a way that's going to deliver an outcome. And public money typically won't ever be spent quite as well or as efficiently as private money, because there's never going to be quite such a sort of focus on the return aspect. And so just getting something done, we've seen this in the UK, all sorts of news recently about large government tenders placed in massive speed because of PPE shortages in the early stages of the outbreak. Well, I'm with Jack, to be honest, we just needed PPE, and yes, it might cost a bit more, and we'd love that to be perfectly efficient. What we should focus on is then getting those processes more efficient for next time, to be resilient, so that when something like this does come along, we have the right procurement processes and we have the right focus on what you get back for your money. That's why I think the Asian countries, probably Far Eastern countries, have done a better job of this, because they've been through this already. They had all those processes in place. They knew how to commission things from a government perspective in terms of diagnostics, in terms of engaging with the public. They just had all that in place. We were just running around like headless chickens. And when you run around like headless chickens, you will gush blood everywhere. There'll be all sorts of money being spent in a way it shouldn't. But so I think we should focus on it for future. We should make it more efficient, but it's never necessarily going to be as efficient as private money. But it's got its place, and it really does have its place. And so we should be welcoming things like BARDA and in the UK BARPA, and all built on the sort of US DARPA type approach. And because it has a place where private money won't come in. It's that blue sky R&D, that early stage innovation, doing things where the private markets won't come. We absolutely need to do, if we set out our goal of these are the outcomes we want, this is the public health situation we want, we have to be able to put money behind it. And we can't necessarily rely on that 100% being private money. So let's use public money. Let's think of the processes of how to do that efficiently, and let's do it in time. Do it well in time, ahead of the next time we have to deal with this.
Michelle, you want to say something, and I want you to also respond to this. Can Europe, the EU, for instance, can it act as a wise investor, or is it just throwing money out of despair or in the sense of urgency and emergency? Michelle, did you hear my question? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I just want to kind of pick up on this. I think that, Andrew's talked rightly, and I agree with him in the basis that we need to kind of prepare and be more resilient going forward. But I think that the public needs to act more like a private investor. We need to get a public return on public investment. And I think some of the difficulty here is that in the past, there has just been a focus on producing a product without thinking about what is the chain to produce that product, and the purpose in public health is not just producing product, it's getting it into the hands of the people that need it, and it's got to be affordable and available, and it's got to be created for the circumstances. And that's particularly the case in relation to resource limited settings, because Europe also has a role in relation to the wider world. I mean, I would come back on two things. Firstly, in relation to transparency, I think that transparency is often ridiculed as but transparency just for transparency's sake, and that is not the case. I think that it's needed for two things. One is for public accountability, to be able to maintain public confidence in the vast amounts of money that are being invested, to show how that money is being spent. I also think that we have seen even in some of the vaccine contracts that there are terms that are extremely important for not just the parties to know, but other procurers to know. So for example, in AstraZeneca, there is a question mark about how long any of the kind of not-for-profit pricing that they're putting forward would last. I mean, they're saying, they originally said that they would determine how long a pandemic lasted for. I also think that there is a kind of self-interest in all of us who are concerned about public interest research and development. If we are going to continue to ask for either direct or indirect public investments, then I think policymakers need to know how much and where that money was spent and how it was spent. I think coming back to this question of what is value in R&D, I agree, it's not about GDP, it is public health outcomes. And I also think that this question of value takes us back to where we started in Europe. I think one of the concerns that drove initially a number of European countries to come together was concerned about high prices of medicines. And those, if we talk about hepatitis medicines, and the justification for those high prices was the value to the health system, but it made those prices unaffordable in Europe and elsewhere, and it led to rationing. So I think this question of how you value, I don't think it has to be have an evidence basis, a rational basis, which is the cost of production plus a margin, plus you can look at the value to some of the other value to the health system, but to say that the R&D actors, particularly late stage R&D actors, are the ones that are able to get all of that societal benefit, I think is highly problematic, and particularly as we are going to be looking like going into a kind of recession. This question that there should be no analysis of how the money was spent, I think is deeply problematic now and for the future. I think the question that is really raised, and it's a question I think people are grappling with also in relation to antimicrobial resistance, and is how do you, when you have a product which is probably not going to be used for some time or is very low, how do you get a value to ensure that people can come into the market? And we've had some experiments already in innovation which I think are worth looking at, like subscription models which separate the price and consumption. We also have other models which can reward. We've have ideas around prize funds. I think those things should be explored rather than start with saying, let's not look at it, let's just see about the value on GDP.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Andrew, because now we started talking, and Jack, then over to you. We started talking about the pricing issue and the affordability debate, which kind of triggered the access to medicines discussion in Europe from, I would say, from Cyprus all the way to Denmark and Ireland. From your perspective as an investor, the question of the high prices or excessive prices in some cases, is it something that you factor in your calculations? Is it something, because you choose to invest, for instance, in rare diseases, if the end product comes with an insane, excessive price, is this something that concerns you? Is it on your mind at all? Is it on your radar?
Yes, it's probably one of the biggest things we focus on when looking at an investment. And so we invest in cell and gene therapies, which have some of the highest price tags of any class of therapeutic. And it's one of the biggest unknowns is just how health systems are going to be able to afford these. And for us to be able to develop it and then sell it, it's a very big risk for downstream if we suddenly find that no one's going to buy these products or their price is going to collapse because your investment case will collapse on the back of it. So we absolutely have to look at it. And the way we look at it is to understand the benefit that's derived from your therapeutic and over what is there currently, and just what the sort of economic benefit is to a health system of that. And so a simple, clear, classic example is a gene therapy which for a rare disease which replaces an enzyme replacement therapy. So a patient who has a lack of an enzyme takes an enzyme replacement therapy. Sometimes these are worth, currently they're treating themselves to stay alive, cost them hundreds of thousands of euros a year. That's just the cost of keeping that patient alive. It's a cost to the health system for as long as they're alive. A gene therapy can come along and it can cure that patient so they never need to take another enzyme again for the rest of their life. That may well be 10, 20 years of hundreds of thousands of medicine cost suddenly down to zero. And so you've got a very clear benefit, and there you can find where a price might come out, and you factor in risks and all this.
You would justify that, so it would be something that you would accept as reasonable. And so
you would say that if that patient is going to cost a health system $10 million over the next 10 years, but you can cure it, then would $1 million price for that cure, would that be acceptable? And that's where these things are currently priced at, albeit at low volume at the moment. But there is big risk as to whether that then becomes, as these therapies go out into more, wider, larger disease populations, maybe don't have quite such a big impact in terms of maybe not a cure, but an improvement. Suddenly you're into much more grey areas where it's really clear cut. You can justify it. And it looks like they, at the moment that they can be paid for, but these are in small disease areas. It's definitely a big concern from investors' perspective, just how that will pan out in future.
Thank you, Andrew. Jack, over to you. Also, because you talked about transparency, so and you've been in investment before, so you have experience. Would transparency or affordability provisions in contracts, would that be a concern for you if you were an investor, for instance? Would that be something that would be a barrier, an obstacle that would discourage investment?
So I was trying to be slightly provocative in my first comments. I think, Michelle, I realize transparency. In fact, I think I've become more sensitive to this lately because I've become less convinced that the country in which I live isn't corrupt. But I do appreciate that. Confidence in people care more about transparency when they lack confidence in public institutions, right? And there are lots of things that have happened in the UK around COVID that mean I have less confidence in public institutions than I did at the start, right? But again, vaccines wouldn't be top of my list. And if we think about public returns on public investment, I would be willing to bet anyone on this panel 20 euros to be settled in 3 years' time, that when we look at the interventions by governments where we've got good public return on public investment, vaccines will be at the top, right? A second thing about transparency is I think it's a bit of a buzzword, and it's not a case of transparency good in transparency bad. There are certain situations in which transparency is good, and there are certain situations in which transparency is bad. And I'll give you a very concrete example, which relates to European drug pricing and related to something I thought about a lot when I worked in investment. So I think the global pharmaceutical industry makes a disproportionate amount of its money from the US, right? In fact, a guy I used to, actually a former competitor of mine, gave a quote which is so brilliant, I say it whenever I have the opportunity, and that is that drug R&D is a little bit like NATO from 1948 to 1989, of great benefit to Europeans, but largely paid for by the Americans, right? And the spread between European and US drug prices, so many Europeans will think that the American healthcare system is mad, right? Drugs are very expensive in the US, not in all cases, in some cases, in oncology, in rare diseases, not in all areas, right? But the drug industry is very frightened that if the Swiss, the Germans, the French, the British are paying only half or less than half as much for their drugs as the Americans, CEOs of drug companies get hauled up in front of Congress, and you risk drug price cuts in the US, which is where they make most of them, which is where they make a disproportionate amount of their profit. And this means that drug price transparency in Europe is not likely to achieve policy objectives other than making drug companies withdraw those products from European countries which have low and transparent prices. And we've already seen this with oncology drugs in the UK, where the NICE process effectively makes the price transparent, and in some cases drug companies choose not to launch, right? So when I think about European countries procuring drugs, my general view is you want as intransparent process as possible so the Americans don't know how much less you're paying than they are, right? And that makes it possible for drug companies to give you the product for less money. So that's just a very specific transparency point that relates to some of the things I used to think about a bit more than I do now.
Yes, Els, over to you. Go ahead, and then I'll add my question.
Yeah, I wanted to react to several of the things that we've heard and come back. And I mean, it's interesting to hear talk about the difference between private capital and public capital, and private capital needs to be efficient and maximize return on investment in terms of financial value. And then you explained how you think about, Andrew, the value-based pricing, value in terms of health, and that again become expressed in dollars. I mean, this is the fundamental problem, right? And we have a extremely financialized biopharmaceutical industry where indeed, and I think that's part of the core of the problem, and that relates also to what you just said, Jack, that we are thinking about it that way is because we have this extremely financialized business model where a lot of money, I mean, is being extracted basically, a lot of value, but then value in terms of dollars is being extracted through to shareholders and venture capitalists and all of that is kind of taken out of the system, paid by often taxpayers and insurance, etc., by paying high prices.
Not taken out of the system.
Sorry?
Not taken out of the system. That's the common fallacy, but
I mean, it's and it's pension funds and it finances whole other things.
But when they make returns, they reinvest back in again.
Very, very little is being invested in R&D. I mean, at the stock buybacks, there have been reports of companies, pharmaceutical companies, that spend as much in buying back their own stocks than in R&D, and we already know that they spend more in marketing than in R&D. So what is going back to R&D is actually relatively minor. And then which R&D? We also know that over half of the new therapies that are, I mean, medicines that get to market have no added therapeutic value. So there is a whole lot of things, and I think we need to use this opportunity not to tinker in the margin of something that is fundamentally, wrongly structured and incentivized, and go back to what, as Michelle was saying, like the purpose should be improving health outcomes of populations, and then think back from there. And I think we're so far in the financial business that even thinking about public capital, sorry, and I'll finish here. I mean, if we think about public return on public investment in similar ways than private capital, we're going to go down the wrong track. We need to bring it back to how do we value improving health outcomes and having a healthy population.
Thank you, Els. Andrew, I'll let Michelle add her comment because I'm sure there will be some alignment, and then you can respond to both. Michelle, over to you, please.
So I think that, when you're talking about the question of drug pricing, I mean, you're worried about the CEOs being called in front of Congress, they are also being called in front of Congress because of high prices in the US. And those investigations have led to a recognition that actually, there's a huge investment by the NIH and others, and public investment. And so this is then, I think, opening up a question that I touched on before, which is that we're relying on a kind of old-fashioned approach to paying for research and development, and I think we need more innovation in the process of funding innovation. And I think that if it's distorting the ways in which the health systems are working. So you're making this kind of argument that the EU shouldn't come together and to be able to use its purchasing power, because if it did, then they would not be able to segment, because doing that they'd have to share some idea of pricing. But I think instead of focusing on the end price, we should be looking at the fact, and it's a reality, R&D costs money. There has to be a way in which you pay for it. But there's been quite a lot of discussion, which has been led by thinkers like James Love and others, about how you can come up with a way that you pay for research and development upfront, and that allows you to look at ways to have the lowest cost production. And in a way, that's where that is what DNDi is. We're paid by grants up front to pay for R&D, and that allows us to go into areas of highest public health need, and not the areas of highest profit, and also allow for generic production straight away. I think these are not easy discussions, but I think they're discussions that need to be had, so that you put the public health need at the forefront, but also recognize that R&D costs money. And I think we're starting to have those discussions in Europe. We're having some experimentation around that. These need to be developed further and taken to scale.
Yeah, and can I say
and then Andrew.
That actually, I wasn't saying Europe shouldn't have these discussions, but what I think in some of the policy debate there's a kind of sort of magical thinking, which is Europe can do these things and it won't have consequences. I think the point I would make is know your counterparty, right? R&D is expensive, and there are certain things that, right, R&D is expensive, and drug companies and their shareholders predominantly want to make money, right? And that means they're not going to do R&D if the drugs are cheap and the R&D is hard. So, but the quantities of funding that are required for public sector efforts, very often governments haven't been prepared to cough up the money. So for example, I have some professional experience in the world of antibiotics, right? And if the number of academic and policy papers on novel incentive mechanisms for new antibiotics were piled one on another, they would reach from here to the moon, right? But as yet, public sector money has not been forthcoming to bring new antibiotics to market, and there have been a number of failed private sector attempts, right? So I think there's a naive criticism, or put it another way, I think doing what the private sector does when it's not doing it is actually very expensive. And to do it seriously, governments have to stump up a lot of cash. And I think there's a perfectly rational economic model, and there's lots of sensible things that could be done that make the situation better. But I don't think governments are prepared to grapple with quite how expensive they would be.
Andrew, and we have 5 more minutes, and then I want to ask my last question. Andrew, over to you.
I've got that. And just very quickly on Jack's comment there, I agree. I think one of the good things that actually might come out of all this is, say on antimicrobials, for example, that actually that whole argument has just been reframed, and that actually governments now will realize that public health, we can't rely on private sources of capital, so we're going to have to do something different. And if the FT series of articles that came out today in the Financial Times on antimicrobials, there's anything to go by, they really are picking up on this. Is becoming a really hot topic, and it's going to, I hope it stays hot, and the arguments are all reframed. But just to come back on Elsa's point, Elsa, I completely agree with you that we absolutely need to add non-financial metrics in, and we need to look at health outcomes and so on. But I think it's a common mistake where people look at the private markets and say, well, these don't always work in every instance, to then say, well, let's get rid of the private, let's just completely think how we can do something completely different, and not understand that actually private money and private markets work well in many instances, but not every instance. And so we should learn about where they work well and apply them where they work well, because there's a lot of capital required in those areas, as Jack's just pointed out. And actually they work very efficiently, and it can do a very good job, and it can provide capital that public markets just wouldn't be able to. And this point about recycling is that when people make returns on private capital, they then reinvest it back into those markets. And it may well be a much bigger picture than that immediate reinvestment back into a pharma and R&D program. It may be a big picture coming back into pension funds and back into public companies and so on and so forth. But they're fundamentally propped up on success. And so where private markets work well is where they should be pointed. But where they don't work well, we should be completely acknowledging of. And this public health episode recently is exactly where they don't work well. And we should not just say, therefore, we must discard them. We must say, how do we augment them to make the public health outcomes achievable? And that's where you need markets which are not all about efficiency. They are more pointed towards health outcomes. That's where we need public funding. And we need all the stakeholders working together. And that's where we then need to Michelle's point, we then need to understand, if you're putting large amounts of public capital to work, how do we then make sure it's being done efficiently? Well, you can learn stuff from the private markets, absolutely, how they look at return on capital. But often when the public sector tries to do things like the private sector, they get it horribly wrong as well. So we shouldn't be too hung up on the way the private sector does it. Let's look at what we're trying to achieve with the public money, and let's go and try and achieve it. And let's try and do it, yes, as efficiently as possible, but let's not necessarily use the way the private markets would do that to assess yourself.
But can I just add on to that? I don't disagree with you, and I don't think I've said that we need to discard the private sector. I think they have an enormously important role, but we cannot, as the public sector, I mean, it's the public that kind of has the purpose of improving health outcomes, and it's the public responsibility. It's not the private sector's responsibility. But if we don't use the public capital and have a governance system in which we then, as a collective public health governance, can somehow shape how the public and private sector will work together towards that public purpose. It's not by putting a little bit of money or even a lot of money and let the markets continue to function. No, that doesn't work. You need to be able then, through a public health oriented governance mechanism, to shape what the private sector is been doing. And so that, I think, is where we need to find, and that needs to be based on public health outcomes. And the market will never respond to that. And it's not by pushing and pulling a little bit. I think that's what we've learned. And what we see today for COVID is that governments have put all that public capital, but they have not stepped in to leverage that in a governance way that actually then will drive access and availability and such that it can maximize improving health outcomes. That, I think, has not happened.
I know, I agree with all that. I agree. We do have to work out how to let these two institutions work better together in a more coordinated and focused way. I think that's what we've learned about in the last 9 months, I think, is they each have their place, but we don't quite know how to make them work optimally together yet, because they have been too separated.
Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, so please, your concluding remarks. I would like to remind us the title, The Winners, the Losers, and the Prospects. So perhaps you would like to choose for your 1 or 1.5 minutes max long remarks, closing remarks. What do you foresee? What are the trends that you foresee unraveling in 2021 and beyond when it comes to this pharma government's dynamic that we talked about today? Michelle, you want to go first?
I mean, I would hope that governments would recognise that that there is a role for them to see themselves more clearly as public investors, and therefore seek to, in their engagement with the pharmaceutical industry, to set the vision and to put in place agreements that deliver on that. and that they also use their funding strength to push for transparency, but also to push for agreements on access. Equally, I think that they also need to recognise that the pharmaceutical industry is not monolithic. I mean, we're talking about, in certain areas, and this is particularly the case in antibiotics, the real innovators are SMEs, and there are different incentives and different approaches depending on the size. And this interplay, I think, as Andrew said, between public and private. So I would hope that governments would see that role more clearly. I'd also hope that the pharmaceutical industry would recognise that they also have a responsibility, particularly in a pandemic, to stand up to what they said at the beginning, which is it's not business as usual, and not seek to go for a for-profit price, and not to block access, particularly for developing countries, to be able to have self-sufficiency by being able to produce their own products.
Thank you, Michelle. Jack, your concluding remarks? You need to unmute yourself, Jack. Yeah.
I was going to ask for a moment to think, actually, because it's interesting. I haven't thought of anything terribly sort of punchy, true, and interesting. Right? I can think of things that are false, punchy, and boring. So let come back to me if you will.
Sure. Andrew.
So I mean, there's lots of winners and losers. I would pull out from my perspective, winners. Digital health, I think, is where we're invested, and that's great. I think the way we deliver care is going to be quite different from now on, and I suspect a lot of that will stick, and the use of digital tools to both deliver and monitor and help disease, but also to help discover new drugs and bring them to market, I think will be a big winning sector. Losers, pubs, certainly in the UK, pubs are going to lose out. I don't know if that's in life sciences, I'm not sure who's going to lose. Unfortunately, the patients clearly will lose, but I'm hoping we can get to a vaccine soon and reduce that. And prospects, I think there's the ability for public and private sector to work better together in a more coordinated and healthcare oriented outcomes way would be a wonderful lasting legacy of this pandemic.
Else?
I think in terms of winners, I would say, but with the luck that Jack already mentioned in the beginning, I think we're very lucky that this first generation of vaccines seem to be, at least having some efficacy. We will have to see whether they actually can cut transmission, because that is all but proven. However, it seems that getting some immunity against the spike protein is a winning strategy, and I think that's if we will have a vaccine, multiple vaccines, because the whole first generation of vaccines is based on that, we might actually end up with 8-9 vaccines that have some effect, and if we can find a way to actually distribute them, scale up the production, then we can avoid that. Because I think the losers for the time being, I think, are developing countries, whichever group you want to see. I mean, they have completely not been at the table of any of the discussions, even though a lot of discussions is supposedly going on about how do we ensure access in those countries as well, but they have been totally sidelined. We've seen this coming together of wealthy government leaders, CEOs of pharmaceutical companies, Bill Gates, Jeremy Farrar, the philanthropist of these worlds, the World Bank. They have and that's another loser, transparency also on that level, not just in the agreements. They have kind of made plenty of agreements, devised a whole ACT accelerator, etc., behind closed doors, with very little oversight, no public, no civil society involvement, or hardly, not meaningfully, and certainly very little developing country involvement. And they sit as a recipient again, waiting for whatever droplets will come down to them, whichever crumbs may still be left by the time that the wealthy countries will have served themselves. And I think that for the time being, the biggest loser.
The prospects?
Prospects, I am hopeful that we will be able to actually use the fact that we have all these discussions to really rethink how we want to, as a society, organize our innovation ecosystem to drive biomedical innovation, including access from the start as a public purpose. And I think we will make progress. We have been able to unlock conversations that were closed before or where we had difficulties in driving it. I want to be an optimist because that's also what I'm doing in my life, trying to move that conversation. And I think we will be able to move the conversation. I don't know where to yet, but yeah.
And Jack, over to you.
So winners, I think anyone who needs a new vaccine in the next 50 years. So actually vaccines novel vaccines is a bit of an oligopoly at the moment. In the last probably 10 years, there's only really been 3 companies interested in it. And actually what we've proven with COVID is we've proven, 1, 2, and possibly more novel vaccine platforms. So there's going to be more companies doing it in more different ways, right? Which is a good thing. Something that may happen, I'm going to mention it anyway, whether COVID will accelerate this, I don't know. But I have always been surprised that there are sort of funny handovers between the private and public sector in drug R&D classically, right? So you have universities I'm caricaturing a bit, but you have universities whose job it is to discover stuff. They then usually, at some point that stuff gets handed over to drug companies who run it until phase 3. Point almost entirely, even in the US, the private sector buys more drugs. The public sector buys more drugs than the private sector. But in European countries, it's typically dominated by the private sector. Now, those handoffs strike me as much less flexible than they could. And I think European governments have been pusillanimous in their enthusiasm for rolling up their sleeves, generating their own data that would be both helpful to their health systems and might allow them to negotiate better drug pricing. So that's one possible prospect.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to an end. I hope you enjoyed this definitely thought-provoking conversation with these incredible brainy people. Thank you very much, Andrew Elder, Els Torell, Michelle Childs, and of course, Jack Scannell. Always a pleasure. Join us next Wednesday, the 25th of November. We will be discussing to senior decision makers from Portugal, Slovenia, and from the Netherlands to look at what the plans of the upcoming presidencies of the EU are from the upcoming Portuguese and Slovenian presidency. We'll talk about access to medicines, and we'll look at the pharmaceutical strategy. The pharmaceutical strategy will be published by the European Commission on the 24th. So 24 hours later, we'll be here to discuss with these leading, very influential policymakers what they make of it and what would they like to see prioritized in the coming year and what should be on the plate of the European Commission and the Council. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.